In this lecture, we'll dive into the topic that will occupy us for the second half of the course, namely the topic of predicate logic. For ease of recording, I've broken this lecture up into multiple parts. So let's go all the way back to the basics, all the way back to an example of a valid argument that we considered at the beginning of the course. So consider the following argument. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is a classic example of a valid argument. I introduced you to this argument at the very beginning of the course when I was explaining to you the distinction between valid and invalid arguments. And this argument is not only valid, it is formally valid. And we can see that because we can see that it has the following structure. All H's are M, S is an H, therefore S is an M. And one can tell just by examining the logical structure of this argument alone that it is valid. One can tell that it is valid if all one knows is that H and M stand for meaningful predicates and that S stands for a name. Knowing those things, one doesn't have to know which predicates H and M stand for or what name S is. One can simply tell that this argument is valid, that any argument that has this structure is valid. Unfortunately, however, propositional logic does not allow us to prove this simple fact. It does not allow us to prove that this argument is formally valid. And that's kind of a bummer because we saw that propositional logic can do quite a bit, and we worked pretty hard to develop it. But this very basic argument that we introduced at the beginning of the course is one that propositional logic cannot show us is valid. So to see this, let's let P abbreviate all humans are mortal. Let's let Q abbreviate Socrates is human. And let's let R abbreviate Socrates is mortal. Given these abbreviations, this argument pattern comes out as the following: P, Q, therefore R. Or in the form of a sequent as the following: P, Q, turnstile R. But this is not a valid sequent in the propositional calculus. One could not write down a proof of this sequent because it's not valid. One cannot tell just by examining the argument structure as it is represented here alone that this argument is valid, even though one could tell that by examining the argument structure as it was represented up in this previous slide. So what's the problem here? Why is it that we can't show that this argument is valid using propositional logic? Well, the problem comes to this. The problem is that propositional variables like P, Q, and R, and so on, are only suited to abbreviate complete declarative sentences. But the reason the argument that we've just considered is formally valid has to do with the subsentential structure that occurs within the complete declarative sentences that we used P, Q, and R to abbreviate. And when we use P, Q, and R to abbreviate those sentences, we lose all that information about the subsentential structure of those sentences. So we lose a lot of the logical information that is contained in the structure of the argument we were considering. So to capture the formal validity of arguments like the one we've just considered, we need ways of breaking into the subsentential structure of the sentences that occur in those arguments. We need ways of representing that information within a formal system and not just throwing it away. And this is something that the predicate logic allows us to do, and we'll start to see how it allows us to do that in the next part of this lecture.